Spider-Man, one of the best comic book superhero characters of all time, is very much ripe for a video game interpretation, and one developer went out to make what IGN calls, arguably, the best Spider-Man game, giving it a 9 out of 10. GameSpot would tout it as an excellent framework on which to base future Spider-Man games, and an exceptional game to boot, and that developer was Neversoft. We're talking about Spider-Man 2000 on PS1. Hey everyone, David here, and as you can see, this is a very loose copy of Spider-Man 2000 on the PlayStation 1. You even have the black actual backside of the disc, and the reason why it's loose is because it originally came in a very in a very yellow envelope from GameStop, being part of this pre-owned sale that they were having, and for like, I think $2? It's like, okay, screw it, I still got my PS2 that has backwards pat on it, play it, and let's go ahead and finally revisit the original PlayStation 1 Spider-Man, the one that's very near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, despite the fact that prior to that game, we actually had quite an amalgamation of Spider-Man games, except the majority of them were on 2D plane. They were very side-scrolly. They weren't really very showy as far as what they brought to the table and what potential there could be for a Spider-Man game. Which is funny because we got Spider-Man games before we even got Spider-Man movies, and the closest to a live-action interpretation was that 70s Spider-Man. Dear God. So Neversoft was actually the brave studio, along with publishing by Activision. We're not really going to talk about them right now. But they're the ones that actually gave us what a lot of people consider to be the pioneering point for a Spider-Man game, because we're finally delving into 3D. And I never played the game from beginning to end. I've dabbled a couple of times when a friend of mine's had it loaded up on their PlayStation 1 back in the day, when I would visit their house, run away from their house. I don't know what I would do, but I never actually sat down and played the game from top to bottom, because at the time I was mainly a Nintendo kid. But for the most part, PS1 and PS2 were kind of on the side front of my gaming upbringing, and because of that, I missed Spider-Man PS1. No longer. This game that first came out in September of 2000, and for the most part it would get quite an awful lot of ports, whether it be in one way or another on Game Boy Advance, Nintendo 64, PC, the like, but most people remember it being on the PlayStation. And the reason why, I feel like there's a strong affinity going on, because as I mentioned, this is developed by Neversoft, but more so, they used the same exact engine for this game as they did for their Tony Hawk Pro Skater series at the time, which is why Spider-Man is an unlockable character in those games, is because they were kind of sharing assets practically, one house to the next, and therefore they gave us this game. And that's why a lot of people remember it fondly on the PlayStation 1 console. And what others remember it by is the fact that this is a game very much based, but not necessarily adapted from that 90s cartoon. The 90s cartoon was in full force at the time. This is literally the year 2000, so the only real strong affinity that people have with Spider-Man, aside from the comics, was the animated series. And though it utilizes a severe amount of likeliness from those shows, whether it be Spider-Man or the animated series, or even Spider-Man Unlimited, utilizing even some of the same voice actors, it never uses any of the storylines going on, whether it be in the comics or in the show. It utilizes its own story, and it's a very 90s cartoon story at that. In fact, it sometimes doesn't even make any sense. It's just a way to kind of bring the enemies and the characters that you know from not just Spider-Man's corner of the Marvel Universe, but almost the entire Marvel Universe. There's some characters here that show up and you're thinking to yourself, yeah, they were in the animated series, but it almost even didn't make sense for them to show up in the animated series. Still, what really charms me into believing all this is the actual aesthetic. It's the cheese factor, or rather the tongue-in-cheek factor from that 90s cartoon, with the fast pace, the very somewhat self-aware, satirical kind of feel to it, and even the voice acting. Like I mentioned before, it's voice actors from the animated series and the Unlimited series are brought over here, so they still bring that inflection, they still bring that nuance that makes you feel like you're playing a 90s Spider-Man cartoon. And because of that, it kind of, you know, pulled at a little bit of my nostalgic heartstrings, and because of that, I was able to kind of go along and not question not only the sensical nature of the story, or even the aged look of the pre-rendered cutscenes, because they did not age very, very well. to the point where character models are supposed to be talking and they're not talking, or they're just repeating animations. But of course, from a game that was in early development in the 2000s, using an engine that was mainly known for the 90s, what game hasn't aged that gracefully? And those pre-rendered cutscenes were even too ambitious for its own time, because the PlayStation copy is actually the only one that has those cutscenes to begin with. The N64 one just utilized comic panels and kind of went ahead without the cutscenes altogether, because it just could not handle it on just that measly little cartridge. So it's kind of almost even a privilege to have even gotten the cutscenes on the PS1 version. And many of these voice actors you will instantly recognize all across the board, quite frankly. Rino Romano, who played Spider-Man Peter Parker in Spider-Man Unlimited, comes back in the title role. Jennifer Hale as both Black Cat and Mary Jane. Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., who most of you know as Alfred from the Batman animated series, comes back as Dr. Octopus from the '94 Spider-Man animated series. And then you even have the GOAT, the legend, the myth himself, Stan Lee, narrating pretty much the entire game. And hearing him is in fact not only a time capsule, but a very dearly held love letter to the legend, or one of the legends that brought us Spider-Man. Then you even have the music that is very much 2000s, but we were already starting to transcend that a little bit with that Spider-Man animated series theme song that I kind of wish we would have heard here once again. But the original menu music and the title card music that you already hear, it has almost an identity onto itself that it's hard to disassociate it with the PS1 Spider-Man game. So we've concluded that the game definitely looks and sounds like a 90s animated cartoon. Now, how does it play? Unfortunately, like I mentioned with the cutscenes, it did age in a bad way. But again, coming from 2000s, what game hasn't exactly done that wasn't Ocarina of Time or Contra or Turok or whatever you want to, kind of pull from that greatest hits collection? As much as I love those games, I recognize that this was the stepping stone for the 3D course of Spider-Man games. And because of that, there's actually something to really talk about from a fundamental standpoint with the gameplay in this game. Because sure, there are times where the gameplay can get kind of frustrating and feel very ratchety and clunky for its early 2000s aesthetic. Sometimes hitboxes miss when you're engaging in combat with Spidey. Sometimes shooting webs don't exactly line up with the direction that you wanted to hit them with, even with the targeting system. And then the web swinging is very basic. You just hold down one button and he'll start web swinging in a very diagonal direction. Sometimes you want him to web swing to a particular platform, but instead he almost web swings at a diagonal pace, and you're just like, why are you just restricted to just this pathway? Why did they program it that way? And again, it could also be because of limitations with the tech. They were again trying to be ambitious with a Spider-Man game, because sometimes the imagination for these developers goes in ways that the technology was just not available at the time, like it is now with companies like Insomniac bringing us 2018's Marvel Spider-Man. On that note, there is a stepping stone from this game that without it, that 2018 Insomniac game probably wouldn't have existed. It's very subtle and nuanced, but there's times whenever Spidey is engaging in combat or exploration, or the way he traverses up a wall and sticks to it by crawling it, to the way he's able to zipline from the floor to the ceiling and vice versa, that does make you think about not just the 2018 Spider-Man, but even the Spider-Man games that came since then, whether it be the movie tie-ins or the spin-offs or the Beenox games. There's like DNA and strands of what you would later find in later titles, such as the punching and the kicking, the patterns and the movements and the physicality that Spidey has with his enemies. You can kind of see some dualities going on, and because of that, I feel like Neversoft had something going on here. Sure, it may feel clunky literally over 20 years later, but there is some appreciation that I found myself having for this original game as I played it, despite my frustrations, that made me think, yeah, no doubt about it, the developers for not just the Insomniac game, but every game since, from the Spider-Man 2 movie tie-in to Web of Shadows, these developers must have played this bad boy at some point or another. And that's not necessarily just tied to the combat. You also have web attacks, whether it be Spidey webbing up his fist to able to give his punches an extra power, as well as a web dome that he's able to then explode and then being able to shoot webs. Does this remind you of the impact web bombs or the spider drones or anything like that from the 2018 Spider-Man? No doubt about it. And a Spidey game would definitely be a disservice if you weren't to go ahead and throw in some boss fights, which later Spidey games would then interpret on their own, but even the original 2000 Spider-Man had, including boss fights up against Doc Ock, Venom, the Lizard, or at least a variation of lizards, and Scorpion himself. Albeit, the way they come into the story is sometimes a little, again, nonsensical, but they're actually rather creative as far as how you go about these boss fights. They feel varied from each other, and you never feel like you're repeating the same boss fight. And sometimes, the only option that you have is not necessarily to fight, but to run. Die! For the longest time, I never understood why people were so scared of this fight here, but after finally going through it myself, I definitely felt the anxiety levels rampant. After completing the game, you also have some side content to check out, whether it be through some of the time trials or extra like practice and challenge modes, as well as a character model viewer that also has its moments of narration from Stan Lee himself, so you can kind of rehear his voice a couple more times, and even these cover arts so you can collect throughout that are hidden throughout the campaign and collect them, and then you're able to revisit them later on in case you ever want to check that out. But if that's not doing it for you and you want to go through the campaign again, you could do so. And if you want to, you can go through it as Ben Reilly Spider-Man or any other costume that you managed to unlock at this point. That's pretty dope. I mean, that's almost a staple now for a Spider-Man game to have alternate costumes, and it's cool to see that even Spider-Man 2000 came up with it. Still though, this is an awful lot of content that they're able to pack on the side that you weren't really exposed to before in other games, especially considering the amount of space that's available on one of these CDs. I'm hoping that my message is coming across very well here, is that though this game has in fact aged, considering that it's an early 2000s PS1 game, there's something very special here, that despite its limited budget and resources that were very made clear abundantly while I was watching the credits roll and noticed that an awful lot of names were being repeated for different roles, making me think that some of these people had to work double or even triple duty to get certain things made, but they made it with a love and affinity for the character and the mythology it created since the comic book days of the 60s, that if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have the games that you probably remember from your childhood, whether it be the Spider-Man 2 movie tie-in with the pizza time, or some of the underrated gems like Web of Shadows or Shattered Dimensions, and then of course the Insomniac 2018 Spider-Man game, for which its sequel we're greatly anticipating in 2023. And I feel like though we had prior NES and SNES games that are very beloved, such as Maximum Carnage, which I might revisit in the foreseeable future, there's definitely something very fundamental and cathartic about the original Spider-Man 2000 game that transcended Spidey into the 3D gaming space. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to hit the thumbs up on the video here, or the thumbs down if you didn't like it. Make sure to comment in the section below if you guys did play the original Spider-Man 2000 on the PS1 hardware or even the N64 version. What are your guys' fondest memories playing this thing, and what are your coolest nightmares running away from that monstrosity there at the end? And also check out this other video here for some more web-headed goodness, and until next time guys, stay humble.